Good evening, everybody. My name is George Young. I teach in the Global Humanities program, the seminar this semester. And so in Anouar Majid, our director's absence, it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the lecture tonight. The topic is especially welcoming, I think, and something that we can all relate to, especially in the economic, political, and meteorological conditions that we've known recently. Desperate for some kindness, a history of asking for help in hard times. Presenting the talk tonight is one of the most distinguished of our professors at University of New England, Elizabeth de Wolfe, professor and chair of the Department of History and co-founder of the Women's and Gender Studies program here at the university, where she teaches courses in women's history and American culture. Professor de Wolfe earned her PhD in American and New England Studies, Boston University, MA in Anthropology from the University of New York, Albany, and her BA from Colgate. Professor de Wolfe is the author of 4 books. In 2007, The Murder of Mary Bean and Other Stories, which was honored with book awards from the New England Historical Association, the Northeast Popular Culture American Culture Association, the Independent Publishers Association, and Forward Magazine. In 2002, her book was published, Shaking the Faith, Women, Family, and Mary Marshall Dyer's Anti-Shaker Campaign, which received the 2003 Communal Studies Association Outstanding Book Award. With Thomas Edwards, Professor de Wolfe edited Such News of the Land, U.S. Women Nature Writers, in the year 2000. Her most recent book, published just last year, is Domestic Broils, Shakers, Antebellum Marriage, and the Narratives of Mary and Joseph Dyer. Professor de Wolfe was a recipient of the Keneally Cup, sort of like an academic MVP, Most Valuable Professor, UNE's highest service honor, and in 2008-2009, Professor de Wolfe held the Ludke Chair of Liberal Arts and Sciences at UNE, an endowed rotating chair awarded to distinguished senior faculty. So tonight, please join me in welcoming and perhaps even showing a little kindness through special attention to Professor Beth de Wolfe. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you to Anouar Majid for inviting me to this intellectually rich and thought-provoking series. Now, it's always flattering to be invited to speak about one's work, and when Anouar initially invited me, he assured me I could talk about anything I wanted to, and this was a year ago. And so in that kind of generous situation, scholars can go 2 ways. We can speak about our completed research, a topic that we know well and that's tried and true, or we can use these kind of invitations as kind of a kick in the pants, as an opportunity to finish that essay or start a new project. So tonight I'm actually going to do a little bit of both. I'm going to touch on some old work, and then I'm going to explore some new. So I'll start with a story. This is a story about a well-dressed businessman who asked me for help in a Washington, D.C. metro station. It was a beautiful April day. It was actually just about a year ago. I was on sabbatical, and I was eagerly anticipating another day's research tucked away in the Library of Congress. As I completed my subway ride and headed toward the exit, a businessman caught my eye. He explained his dilemma. His Metro card did not have enough cash on it to exit the station. So he had to add value to it, but he only needed a few cents. But the kiosk kept rejecting his crumpled $20 bill, and he had no other cash. Could I help? Did I have a 20 I could exchange with his? Now, who hasn't been the victim of a difficult vending machine, an uncooperative scanner, or a worn-out magnetic strip? So I reached into my pocket and I pulled out $1, hoping that it would give him enough change and prevent him from becoming DC's version of Charlie on the MTA. And as I departed, I started to turn left and then realized I had meant to go right. And as I recrossed the subway platform, I saw the man asking another woman for help. He caught my eye and he smiled again, and I laughed to myself. I'd been scammed. Scams, confidence men, tricksters, and scoundrels. The line between trust and trickery seems slim indeed. Boys trapped in helium balloons, sailing over the desert, former royalty with fortunes to share. A phone call reveals your nephew is stuck in a Canadian jail. In our age of 24-hour news, we are well familiar with these modern-day scams. The most insidious cut particularly deep. Fake charities to help the victims of Katrina. A teenager's claim to have been gang raped. A woman who pretends to have cancer. So perhaps we are a nation of cynics, disbelieving all we see. Or perhaps we are a nation of optimists, believing that $1 can make a difference. According to a recent article in the Portland Press Herald, in these hard times, scams are on the rise in Maine. And popular schemes here include Craigslist and eBay frauds, foreign lottery wins, roof shoveling schemes, and an interesting ploy called Cameroon Dog. So tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit about asking for help and how that has intersected with print culture. And this is by no means a comprehensive history, nor, I hasten to mention, the subject of extensive research. This is more some reflections on the commoditization of desperation, born out of my research projects that have examined collectively the way women have found themselves in print, how ordinary women have endured extraordinary events and found their very lives as subjects or as authors or as both as a commodity. Now, we're very familiar with that idea today. The plethora of so-called reality shows begin with the premise that real lives are interesting or engaging or perhaps even educational, and that people, some people, viewers, cable providers, or advertisers will pay to watch these lives unfold. In my own research on anti-Shaker activists and on mill girls, what has struck me in these stories has been the way, since early on in the antebellum period, people's very lives become saleable. They're commodities to be sold hot off the press to eager readers. So tonight we'll talk about two antebellum era stories of asking for help. The first is that of Mary Marshall Dyer, who in the early 19th century begged for help in retrieving her 5 children, which she claimed were held against their will with a perilously dangerous group, the Shakers. Estranged from her husband, Dyer found herself legally and socially invisible and without a viable means of support. So using the power of print, she reaches out to a public audience, pleading for help. As does Leonard Trask, known as the Wonderful Invalid. Trask, who was from the town of Peru in Oxford County, Maine, turns to print after he develops a terrible chronic illness. So both Dyer and Trask use print to carry their tales, but they carry their own pamphlets, going door to door seeking the help they need. But are they believed? Do we trust them? On what basis do people give them the help that they seek? And as rural life gives way to urbanization, there are new opportunities and new challenges in asking for help. So we'll think a little bit about Horatio Alger's novel, Ragged Dick, and how this wildly popular work, set in the rapidly growing city, suggests a new set of skills needed by the up-and-coming young urban dweller, in particular, a degree of cynicism. And finally, we'll end with a return to the personal plea for help, the direct approach of seeking assistance, cardboard sign in hand. So we'll begin in the early 19th century with an interesting man whose name was Absalom Blackburn. And Blackburn styled himself a modern pamphleteer, as he, like many others in the opening decades of the 19th century, took pen in hand to craft a narrative sharing his unusual experience. In his case, his time living with the Shakers of Ohio and Indiana. He wrote to salvage his reputation after his dalliance with what was still a suspect group. He wrote to grind his own axe. He was angry at the Shakers for their failure to pay him for his communal labor. He even wrote to complain about the housekeeping skills of the women of Kentucky. He begrudgingly admitted that if it's one thing that the Shakers do well, it's keep a neat community. And he no doubt wrote to make a little money. Blackburn wrote and published his small pamphlet in the second decade of the 19th century simply because he could. If you were moderately literate and had a bit of money, you too could be an author. And as the price of paper fell and the transportation networks across the country grew, as printing technologies improved, and as literacy itself rose, it created greater and greater audiences for texts, and placing oneself in print became a not unusual occurrence. So in this printing revolution, print culture provides lots of different texts. There were novels, which were not approved reading. There were religious tracts, which were. And there was an explosion of newspapers and histories and biographies, and a genre not quite top-tier literature, personal narratives, these stories of ordinary people who endure extraordinary events and suffered silently as a result. But with print, people who had no public voice and no access to power could find a new venue in which to share their story, and they mustered their courage and they asked for help. Personal narratives were written by the routinely voiceless. We have them from war veterans, the elderly, the lame or disabled, and women, people who were left behind of the American dream. Now they had a way back in through print. Historian Anne Fabian illustrates in her study called The Unvarnished Truth how narratives of personal tragedy were exceedingly popular. She explains, the very possibility of telling tales based on experience has been a refuge for the weak and the ruined, a means for those deprived of power, authority, and education to come before the great public. And any number of individuals could turn tragedy into commodity. Slaves, beggars, Barbary pirate captives, prisoners of war, divorcing couples, all offered the public a peek into private realms. These narratives collectively give us both a history of a very personal life and a personal view of history, as these largely unschooled authors in relaying their tales also reflect key issues and tensions in society at large. Mary Dyer's text, for example, connects readers to the dilemmas of changing gender roles and the question of expectations for husbands and wives in the New Republic. Absalom Blackburn's tale of moving from one Shaker village to another reflects young men's mobility and the challenges of that new freedom. These tales, sold cheap, provide an intimate view into ordinary American lives, a micro-historical window into the day-to-day challenges of simply living in the new United States, while at the same time, these accounts look outward and reflect the concerns of American culture at large. Are they true? Probably not, but that doesn't really matter. In the end, what matters is that these accounts said something that readers were ready to believe was true, and if the authors were successful, then the readers were moved to do something about it. So let's start with Mary Marshall Dyer, whose story I first encountered in graduate school. I wrote my dissertation, I hear myself now. I wrote my dissertation on anti-Shaker writing, a narrative genre that makes its first appearance in 1780, just as the Shaker faith began large-scale growth and established the form familiar to us today. a celibate group living in self-sustaining communities separate from the world. Now, in my dissertation, I was particularly interested in apostate authors, those who had been one-time Shakers, who, finding some dissatisfaction with the faith, left and put their stories into pamphlets and books. And there were some 24 of these apostate authors who wrote numerous texts between 1780 and roughly 1855. Mary Dyer's story became the focus of my dissertation and then the focus of my first monograph, Shaking the Faith. As an author, she shares many of the conventions of the anti-Shaker narrative with her fellow apostate authors. But Dyer's story had some marked differences, too. She is the only female Shaker apostate author to publish. Her story captivated the reading public and the Shakers like no other anti-Shaker author before or after her. Among the apostate authors, she alone asks specifically for help. The male authors profess and pronounce and accuse the Shakers of all sorts of things, but she asks her readers to take action. Dyer was well read into the 19th century, sometimes as a symbol of abject victimhood at the hands of a heartless religion, and at other times she was seen as a symbol of unreasoned vituperative revenge, an unhinged mind attacking a Christian sect just trying to mind their own business. Her words have found 21st century readers as well. As George explained, last July I just published Domestic Broils, which republishes Dyer's first anti-Shaker work, A Brief Statement, along with Joseph Dyer's Rebuttal, a compendious narrative, and is one of the two works I assigned for tonight. And if you're interested in reading Mary Dyer's Brief Statement, you can find it in my own edition. The original pamphlet is quite scarce, but you can find it at major research libraries. You can also find A Brief Statement on Google Books. And wouldn't Dyer and all our authors of personal narratives be happy about that? My publisher, not so much. So here's Mary Dyer's story. We'll back up a second. There we go. Here's Mary Dyer's story. Mary Marshall was born in 1780, and she was one of 12 children. She grew up on the northern New Hampshire frontier in circumstances that perhaps encouraged her skills of self-reliance and independence. In 1799, she married Joseph Dyer, who was a widower with one young son. Now, Joseph was from Connecticut, and he grew up in a well-established town where perhaps roles and duties were more tightly defined. The Dyers established their home and farm in northern New Hampshire, and they had 5 children in quick succession. In 1811, Lemuel Crooker, an itinerant preacher, brought to Stewartston, New Hampshire, a copy of the Testimony of Christ's Second Appearing, at that time commonly called the Shaker Bible. It's a lengthy and very dense book outlining the theological beliefs of the Shakers, which at that time was still a new sect. The Dyers and several of their neighbors were intrigued, so the Dyers visited the nearest Shaker community, and that was in Enfield, New Hampshire. And after 2 years of indecision, first Joseph believed, but Mary did not. Then Mary would espouse Shakerism, but Joseph had drifted away. The Dyers decide mutually to join the Enfield Shakers. So with all 5 of their children, Joseph's stepson, and several neighbors, the Dyers moved to Enfield in 1813. And at first they were quite happy. For Mary, Shakerism provided an outlet for her preaching aspirations. For Joseph, communal living provided relief from the difficulties of farming pretty much alone. But as Joseph settled into Shaker life, Mary began to chafe in the very rigid hierarchical community. Because although women could be leaders in Shakerism, Mary was disappointed in her slow progress towards such a leadership role. And although the faith was founded and currently led by a woman, Mary found that the elders were not receptive to her ideas for improvements in the faith. And by 1815, the situation had become intolerable, and Mary decided to leave. So she called a meeting with the elders and Joseph, and at first this meeting was quite civil. The elders were not disappointed to lose Mary as a convert. she was what they would call a bad fish caught in the gospel net. And as far as Joseph was concerned, the Dyer marriage was over long before their interaction with Shakerism. But then Mary announced her intention to take the Dyer children with her, and both the elders and Joseph refused. And so in January of 1815, Mary Dyer leaves the Shakers in quite a dramatic fashion. While the Shakers are at meetings, she snatches her youngest son from a caretaker, hails a passing sleigh, and after a frenzied sleigh ride and a public fight with Joseph, who follows her all the way to Hanover, New Hampshire, Mary finds herself very much alone, about 8 miles away from the Shakers and from her children. For the next 2 years, Mary Dyer is very much at loose ends, and she bounces from the home of one relative or another. Joseph does provide a series of homes for Mary, but he hires her board at increasingly distant places, 8 miles away, 28 miles away, 100 miles away. And Mary's anger and frustration continues to grow until 1817, and that's when Mary petitions the New Hampshire legislature for help. She wants the legislature to force Joseph to support her, and this was very routine in the period. Citizens in need of assistance would write a petition seeking redress from a host of problems, from property disputes, labor claims, and in New Hampshire, marital difficulties. Mary's petition failed, but she learned an important strategy. Use pamphlets as a way to tell your story to legislators in advance of your formal petition, a way to prime the pump, so to speak. And if the public wants to read that pamphlet and even pay you for it, perhaps you'll gain their support as well. So Mary Dyer publishes a brief statement in the summer of 1818 in advance of her second legislative hearing. The Shakers were caught off guard, and initially they could only publish a very short remonstrance or rebuttal to her claims. Joseph's text would not come out until about 6 months later, in the winter of 1819. The argument in Mary and Joseph's paired texts come down to this: who broke the marriage agreement? Was Mary a good wife? Was Joseph a good husband? Did Joseph adequately support Mary? And should he still support Mary, even though they were estranged? Now, these texts are not legal documents in a divorce trial per se, but both Mary and Joseph well understood the social expectations for husband and wife and the standards for divorce in New Hampshire. Their works mirror divorce pamphlets of the day, which in fact is another genre of personal narratives. They document the collapse of their marriage, and the accusations they level at each other are geared toward winning a divorce case. But what makes these particularly interesting reading back then and now is that the Shakers, a celibate, closed community, forms the backdrop of this debate. Publishers took great advantage of this and of this salacious tale with a public peep into two private realms, a marriage and the Shakers. Advertisements in the newspaper urged, read both sides, and indeed, the public did. But Mary needs help. She's married, but without her husband. She had no legal or social identity. She could not enter into a contract on her own. She could not buy or sell property. She could not contract a debt. She has no control over her children. She is legally and socially invisible. So when we look at her title page, we get some insight into the case that Mary is trying to make for herself. She highlights her own name, which by then was very well known because of her reports of her legislative petition in the newspapers. And the other big word is Shakers. There we are behind me. One thing that she emphasizes is her authorship, and she uses the phrase, written by herself. And this phrase is loaded with meaning. First, she's establishing literacy, that she wrote it by herself. This was not ghostwritten. This is not fiction. This is not a novel. She wrote it. But she wrote it, and she wrote it without any assistance. And in a later portrait, which appears in her next book, Mary reiterates her literate status by her pen in hand. But written by herself has another meaning as well. She's a married woman because of the suffering she's endured, And now she is by herself. She wrote this, but by herself. Not with her family, not living with her husband, not with children surrounding her, but alone, by herself. A married woman alone, a mother without her child. This was just not a social category that should exist in the early 19th century. So Mary is drawing on your sympathy, but she's going further on this title page. To make sure that we understand that she's truthful, she adds affidavits and certificates. And she also uses the Shakers' own words against them with a declaration from their own publication. Again, indicating that the veracity of her account, that she had actually been at the Shakers, she knew of the Shakers, she has their publications, and she has affidavits to support her. So all of these things set up the reader to believe that Mary Dyer is going to tell us a truthful statement. Since leaving the Shakers in 1815, Mary had told her story to groups of friends and then friends of friends, carefully shaping and framing her narrative with each telling. She spoke in churches, she spoke at camp meetings, she met other former Shakers who were all too happy to share their tales of woe, and then introduced Mary to other former Shakers, and she slowly built a network of support. But she needed money, she needed action. So to get help, she needed to show herself to a wider audience, and to an audience that had real power, to show herself to be a good wife and mother, and that she had upheld what came to be called by later scholars true womanhood. True womanhood were virtues that marked a true woman, the hallmarks of a true woman. Mary displays each of these attributes in her text. Early on in her narrative, Mary asserts that she can tell a true religion from a false one. She is pious. When Shaker books first arrive in the Dyers community, Mary recalls, "This was astonishing and disappointing and the first information I ever had of the Shakers. Strange as it was, Mr. Dyer was induced to go and see them. I had strong impressions that their belief was contrary to the gospel. It caused me great grief to see him enraptured with new imaginations." In later writings, she describes how she made a deal with God when two of her children had the smallpox, and that she would be pious if he would let her children live. Dyer quotes scripture, and while at the Shakers, Mary described how she prayed alone in a room while the Shakers were at meeting, and her prayers were so powerful that it shook the elders. So piety, one of the hallmarks of true womanhood. Mary also portrays herself as a pure woman who was horrified by Shaker practices, which included, she alleged, and at this point she had to refer to biblical passages to make these accusations, that some Shakers, in fact, were paired up, despite the pretension to celibacy. She writes, "I pretended ignorance, but oh, I thought you were the basest of the depraved. One of the elders said I must endure a certain scene to prepare me for their holy state, but he did not know as I should be able to endure it and live. Much more was said, but as I have already wrote beyond the delicacy of my sex, in order to give the reader a few ideas of their pernicious practices, I shall state no farther." Mary claimed that Shaker John Lyon was stalking her and that she had been selected to be his partner. She writes, "At this time there appeared to be a man selected out who was filled with the spirit of the earth and who was placed in every situation to see me and meet me and not be discovered by the lower orders. The Shakers told her, 'The world's people think we are afraid of each other, but they do not know the liberties which we take.' Decent women were pure, and Dyer made sure you understood her to be a decent woman." Now, good women, good wives, were to submit to their husbands, and Mary Dyer is very careful in her text to indicate her secondary role in the Dyer marriage. She claims that she went to the Shakers only to follow and protect her children, acquiescing to Joseph's demands as a good wife should. And a good woman should be domestic. And here, Dyer's affidavits speak for her. An affidavit is included from several judges and justices of the peace, which, if you do a little genealogical research, you find out are her brothers-in-law. And this affidavit states that Mary is a person of good character, of strict truth and veracity, and one who has always been a faithful woman to her husband, and economical, as well as industrious in her business while she had the care of her family. Dyer writes of her children as promising and repeatedly cries over their treatment. Her argument is straightforward. The Dyers were a happy, productive family until Shakerism came into their lives. Joseph paints a very different portrait of their marriage. Where Mary blames Shakerism for seducing Joseph with their ludicrous beliefs, Joseph squarely blames Mary. He asserts their home was a battleground, and Mary was a bad wife and mother. Going to the Shakers was not the cause of their problems. For Joseph, it was an attempt to be relieved of his marital woes. One quote from a compendious narrative will suffice to relay Joseph's perspective. He writes that shortly after his marriage, I soon found that I must either live in a state of perpetual uproar or else condescend to let her do just as she pleased and yield an implicit obedience to her in all things. And as I always abhorred quarreling, I submitted to the latter and thought at that time that of the two evils I had chosen the least. But I have since doubted it. In summary, Joseph argued that it was Mary, a self-centered he-woman, lustful wife, lousy mother, who ruined the Dyer family. Joseph, in joining the Shakers, was attempting to protect his family by bringing them to a community that was truly Christian. As for giving Mary the children her support, Joseph claims it's out of his hands. They willingly indentured the children to the Shakers, and she willingly left his bed and board. And he claims that regardless of that fact, as I have the first and exclusive right with regard to the protection of my children, vested in me not only by the laws of man, but by the Creator, Joseph will not turn over his children. So Mary and Joseph are battling this he said, she said debate on the floors of the legislature, in the newspapers, and in print. And here's the dilemma that Mary finds herself. As Joseph articulated, the laws of man and the laws of God do not favor single motherhood in the early 19th century. Mary realizes this legal and cultural limbo, and in crafting her story, she draws upon the genre of captivity narratives, casting herself as the true Christian mother suffering among the heathen Shakers. Now, readers were really familiar with this genre, and it's a genre particularly appropriate for women to craft. It's one of the few appropriate subjects for women to write about. Mary supports her text with affidavits, testifying to her good standing as a wife, mother, and neighbor, and she places herself in the text with a visceral connection to her readers, often penning how she must stop writing for the tears of anguish are filling her eyes and dripping onto the page and ruining her ink. So she's using sentiment to connect to women. She uses legal strategy, like affidavits and citing another similar case in New York, to appeal to men. She begged for help with this keen realization of the gendered bind she was in. As I show here, who can have sensations with me? Can any? I think some mothers can, but they cannot relieve me. She knew women couldn't make laws. They couldn't help her. I call for the tender feelings of fathers to have pity on the feminine sex. Nonetheless, the legislature refused to intervene, although they suggested to Mary that if she found more evidence of abuse to more than just her, perhaps they could do something. And this is what prompts Mary Dyer's continued campaign, through which she adroitly used print to advocate her causes. So Dyer travels New England seeking additional evidence of Shaker abuse and at the same time telling her own story. She gives talks and she sells her work face to face and details that experience in her later writings. And people either love her or hate her, as these quotes indicate. She takes great pride in the success of what she terms her business. The personal campaign, the personal plea connects Dyer to her supporters. When her daughter Betsy dies from tuberculosis at the Shakers in the 1820s, Mary Dyer learns about this in the newspaper. And she later writes how she, and a grieving mother, had to ask women, strangers, for the appropriate mourning clothes, help that Joseph should have provided. Even the typos on some of her publications provide that connection between author and reader. And this handwritten message appears to be in Mary Dyer's own hand from what I've seen of other accounts, where she writes, "Please to read and understand. Typographical errors are many, some are corrected." And I've seen several editions of her works where she very laboriously goes through and corrects all the typos. But again, it's that connection between author and reader. So Mary Dyer would continue her campaign against the Shakers for the next 50 years. Her heyday was the 1820s, and surviving correspondence from Shakers and non-Shakers capture the continual conversation that Dyer had stimulated. But was it true? Were Mary's allegations horrid lies or gospel truth? Or was it somewhere in between? In some ways, again, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that a significant portion of readers believe them to be true, and based on that belief, were moved to help her, to help Mary and to help women like her, to answer that desperate plea for some kindness. While a number of anti-Shaker and former Shaker authors jumped into print, not all found success or support. Perhaps it was harder for the public to sympathize with the male former Shakers who could provide for themselves. Or perhaps, as former Shaker Benjamin Green complained when his 1830s autobiography failed to sell well, that readers had moved on to other interests and complaints about the Shakers had become rather old hat. Mary Dyer turned her unusual experience into a lifelong calling and a commercial enterprise through which she achieved a modicum of success. Her plea in front of the legislature and the public agitation about her case prompted the New Hampshire legislature to examine and eventually modify divorce law, creating an option that let couples like the Dyers out of their marriage bonds. The Dyers divorced in 1830. Although financial records of her book sales do not survive, Dyer did not end up a pauper. After her divorce from Joseph, she bought a house, one of two that she would own. And in fact, instead of becoming the poor, as residents of the town of Enfield had once worried, she provided for the poor. Dyer went on to write 5 major works of anti-Shakerism, and she died in 1867. While Mary Dyer is careful to play the role of one who needs providing for, using cultural stereotypes of dependent femininity to her advantage, the ideal of providing for oneself and pulling one's own weight is particularly keen in male accounts of desperation. And so here's kind of the new part here. This is a pamphlet that came across my desk recently, and I'm just intrigued by this. So here's Leonard Trask, and here's another example of asking for help. But like many male authors, he asks with great hesitation, not wishing to impose upon his neighbors, his community members, or other readers. And it's interesting because it's the same pretense that Joseph Dyer uses in his rebuttal to what he calls Mary's imposition on the public. Leonard Trask is a rural farmer with a severe physical disability, and his text, like Dyer's, highlights the life and sufferings of the author, but challenges us with this curiously juxtaposed phrase, wonderful invalid. And let me note that the authorship is a bit unclear. There is an editor who writes an introduction prior to the main text, which moves back and forth between the first and third person. It may be that this tale is as told by Trask rather than literally written by him, and perhaps because of his disability. But nonetheless, he, like Mary Dyer, does hawk his own story, handing his pamphlet out in person to people as he describes the desperate need for doing so. And these are illustrations from the account. Leonard Trask was born in Hartford, Maine in 1805, and he was the son of a long line of New Englanders, which Trask makes clear in the first pages of his pamphlet as a claim to community and to long-standing roots. He was a dutiful son, hard worker, and at the age of 27, he married Eunice Knight. Trask commenced housekeeping with lively hopes of future prosperity. With the labor of his own hands, he accumulated the means of starting fair in life and the foundation of future competence and success. Trask is the very image of the hardworking man, the rural youth caught up in the antebellum fervor of upward mobility. But in 1833, he was thrown from a horse, landing on his head and neck. Trask developed severe pain, and he can hardly work his farm, but he perseveres anyway in continuing his agricultural pursuits. Just as he starts to recuperate physically, his farm animals are struck with the bloody murrain, a highly contagious disease, and he loses 9 cows, 4 oxen, and several smaller cattle, and then he lost 4 horses. So during winter, in economic need, he turned to another typical Maine occupation, timbering. But the snow was very deep, and he caught a chill, and his spinal difficulties returned. As his condition worsened, Trask sees lots of doctors who perform all sorts of hideous and useless treatments. It's interesting, after his experience with several doctors, Trask condemned the practices of the so-called regular, or MD, physicians and turns to a Thomsonian physician, but unfortunately, he does no better. Trask seeks medical help in Boston, but finds no relief, and he returns to Maine, increasingly desperate to find a way to provide for his family and increasingly despondent over the ineffective state of medicine. Perhaps this is the wider critique that resonated with readers similarly troubled or afraid of chronic illness. Trask, in fact, had ankylosing spondylitis, a progressive debilitating disease related to arthritis in which the patient over time loses mobility and suffers from a severe deformity of the spine. Spinal joints become severely inflamed, leading to severe chronic pain and discomfort. And in the most advanced cases, the inflammation can lead to new bone formation on the spine that causes the spine to fuse in a fixed, immobile position, sometimes creating the forward stooped posture that Trask shows. As Trask tells his story, he writes, from the year 1843 up to the present period, and this would be 1858, his life has been a continued series of afflictions, privations, and pain. His physician bills are heavy, he can't work, he's in constant pain, and his wife is feeble. In 1845, Trask contracts consumption, but he survives. As the economic head of his household, he can't afford illness. His editor assures us, notwithstanding his infirmities, Mr. T has always continued to labor for a livelihood and sustenance for himself and his family. But it gets increasingly difficult, and this illustration is from a little anecdote about Mr. Trask trying to get some firewood. And as he's cutting this tree, the tree snaps off the stump and actually catches him between the legs and kind of lifts him up off the ground. He drops his axe. He can't see because of his stooped position, so he's stuck here. He's basically stuck dangling from this tree. So farming becomes way too difficult, so he turns to peddling. But his success was defeated by his uncouth figure and deformity. The ladies and children were frequently frightened and fled whenever he made a call. This was an unfortunate state of things for a peddler whose manner of deal brought him into social communion with the fairer sex. So in one instance, residents of a house run and hide when he knocks on the door. So Trask lets himself in, and he sits down, and he starts to read a newspaper that he's found on a table. And he writes, "The inmates of the house, having great confidence in the reading portion of the community, soon began to make their appearance from different parts of the house, concluding that anything that could read, very likely, was human." So like Mary Dyer with her raised pen and her assertion of writing by herself, Trask proves his own literacy by reading the paper, and thus demands entrance into, or at least acceptance, by the middle class. In 1853, Trask is thrown once again from a wagon. This time he breaks his ribs and his collarbone. The series of accidents leaves Trask hesitant to ride alone. He's now so bowed over that he finds it hard to guide the horse. But traveling by foot is no easier. He is often the cause of carriage accidents, as he frightens both horses and passengers. In one instance, a carriage owner threatens to flog Trask for scaring his horse and upsetting his passengers, and concludes, such a man has no right to appear in the streets. In 19th century etiquette, those with infirmities who were visually displeasing were supposed to remove themselves from public view. So those who are physically disfigured and need help and then actively seek it transgress multiple rules of etiquette, the marker of middle and upper class society and the very population the infirm want to reach to get help. So by his very presence, Trask is marking himself as an other, a different class, and even to some who see him, perhaps even a different species. And this is why in his writing we see any number of pleas to try to make clear that he is, or at least was, of a respectable class, that he was a diligent farmer, he was a provider, he was upwardly mobile. But with his hoarse, scaring appearance, Trask is disrupting the safety, security, and stability of his community, who perhaps, like today when we look away from panhandlers, do not like to be reminded of the darker possibilities of human existence. Interestingly, the man who tells Trask he has lost his right to use the street adds, "But if he must go out, the community ought to furnish him with a horse and sleigh," pointing out the failing of Trask's community to help, while simultaneously deftly moving responsibility for humanitarian response from the individual to the more amorphous community. And this is not unlike Mary Dyer and the town of Enfield, who get caught up in her complaints about the Shakers and complain to the legislature about the wives of Shaker husbands roaming around town, crying in the streets and disturbing the peace. So we see here a familiar contemporary refrain: someone ought to do something. But no one was doing something for Dyer or for Trask. And so they ask, annoyingly, repeatedly, persuasively, and craftily, for help. Despite the lack of community intervention, Trask maintained his spirit, he claims, and he raises 7 children and protects and provides for his family. Throughout his text, he asserts his attempt to maintain his role as husband and father. And here's an interesting juxtaposition with Dyer. As a woman, Mary would be expected to bear her sadness and privations privately, taking what God metes out with grace and humility. Her obituary would have read something along the lines of, "She submitted to her Maker's will and is now rewarded with a better life." But silence would not get Mary help. And so Mary, who was ambitious and charismatic and a very capable woman, had to speak up and speak out. Although, as we have seen, she very carefully walks the line between submissive and self-centered. Dyer's actual obituary, by the way, noted her masculine cast of mind and stated how she acted and thought with great independence. It really wasn't a compliment. Now, as for Trask, he could have remained silent and endured his tribulations. He would have been called stoic, but this would not have earned him any rewards in heaven. Historian Heather Curtis writes how passivity contradicted cultural prescriptions for male behavior, and men who were forced to adapt a recumbent posture rarely received accolades for bearing their afflictions with patience. Men provided for themselves and their families, regardless. So in her publications, Mary Dyer worked hard to show herself as a caring Republican mother. Trask works hard to depict himself in the ideals of manhood, a man with vitality, reason, and self-mastery. He repeatedly reminds readers that despite his physical degradation, he retains his mental faculties. But he needs help. One opportunity for the deformed in the 19th century was to become the object of the paid-for gaze. Many showmen, such as Phineas T. Barnum, tried to hire Trask on account of his strange and peculiar form to be placed on exhibition, but Trask refused. And I'll note here that Barnum did hire several troops of former Shakers who performed Shaker dances and songs as a curiosity. They performed alongside acts of orangutans and monster snakes. So perhaps it's not surprising that Trask did not want to join this menagerie. And his response seems dutiful to God. He writes, "My reply has ever been that my misfortunes and afflictions, my pains and sufferings were my own. My singular figure and deformity was my own, and as it had pleased God to afflict me, that I had become a living human curiosity and a wonder to his fellow men, I would sell or hire myself to no man to become a source of speculation in their hands." But then Trask moves to a more self-interested position. "And if my singular form presented to the mind of fellow men a subject of curiosity, wonder, interest, or instruction, the sight should become a source of profit to no one but himself." In In the era long before social services or welfare, the rural solution to poverty or disability or both was a system of bidding out the poor. And urged to put himself upon the town as a pauper, Trask refused to subject his wife and children to that, nor could he lay aside his rights as a free and independent citizen and lose his identity and the control of himself. The self-mastery so prized by antebellum manhood. And here we note that this is the very same self-mastery of self and family that Joseph Dyer claims in his battle with Mary. But for Trask, near the end of his life, he draws on his last asset, his story, which was set in print by a Portland printer in 1858 and sold for 15 cents. He sells it door to door, although this direct sales is downplayed in the text itself. What's not stated is his market savvy. Trask and his biographer travel to New York City with the pamphlets, selling them to whoever they meet and whoever would buy. An Oxford County Town History records that he did not make much money, although one physician did offer him $500 for his body after death. So why write? Well, he hopes his life story will be an example to admonish us of the transitory nature of sublunary hopes and prospects, the delusive and fleeting character of earthly bliss. He wants to teach the young the priceless value of health, to teach readers how you can suddenly go from joy to sorrow, hope to despair, and from the height of worldly pleasure to the depth of human woe. He wants to remind readers in a way very reminiscent of Dickens' Tiny Tim, to count their blessings and remember in seeing others suffering that their lives could be much worse, and that they will endeavor to realize that heaven-born happiness that flows from a consciousness of making others happy around them. And if you could make another happy by buying Trask's pamphlet, that would be good too. Was this story true? Well, apparently yes. The various incidents, like the firewood gathering, may be anecdotal, but Leonard Trask is recorded in the Maine census, and he appears in a 19th century Maine town history with a biographical entry penned by someone who claims to have known him. This carte de visite was produced in the 1850s and was itself sold as a commodity, documenting desperation. But despite Trask's claims of near poverty in 1850, according to the census, his real estate was worth $700. Interestingly, a decade later, his real estate is almost doubled to $1,200, with another $600 of personal estate indicated as well. In both instances, he is financially on par, if not better off, than most of his farmer neighbors. In neither the 1850 or 1860 survey did the enumerator check off the box indicating one was a pauper or deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. Like Mary Dyer, Trask did not become one of the town poor. He provided for himself, and he died in 1861. So Dyer and Trask succeeded in getting some help, in part because of the rural environment in which they lived and touted their stories. In the small community, they and their stories or their antagonists were familiar, and seeing was believing. Both adroitly used gendered stereotypes to demonstrate the worthiness of their help. Dyer as the dependent woman, although independently selling her books, and Trask as the independent man who was dependent on family and friends for day-to-day survival. But the beauty of print culture is that the stories can and did move beyond their authors and beyond the local area. And both Trask and Dyer's pamphlets survive to present day, telling us that they were read and saved and reread by subsequent generations who never knew these sufferers. And so by the mid-19th century, the market was flooded with stories of tragedy and romance and murder and other horrors, as a sensational press, both in newspapers and in pamphlets, fed a willing market for tales of woe. Personal desperation and tragedy continued to be commodified, but with industrialization and urbanization now aimed at a national audience. So thus, individual stories become fodder for print in a way different from the days of Dyer and Trask. The desperate cries are the same, but the details get a little fuzzy, fictionalized to better fit expectations and good sales, like what happened to the real-life mill girl Beringia Caswell in her fictionalized story, Mary Bean. It's almost like a made-for-TV movie that adds a bit of drama to make the audience like it better. These works make visible desperation while rendering invisible the actual sufferer. Inevitably, these works begin the same way. This is a true story, told not to sensationalize tragedy, but to serve as a model so you too will not find oneself in desperate straits. Thus, instead of serving as a vehicle for an individual to ask for help, these fictionalized personal stories serve to help you avoid the victim's fate. Urban society gives a new impetus for asking for help and for being scammed. So let's look briefly at Ragged Dick, the hero of Horatio Alger's 1868 tale, and he introduces us to the opportunities and challenges of the city. Now, Dick is a bootblack. He lives by his wits. He's honest, ambitious. He would never steal, but he's too free with what little money he has. In between his hand and mouth existence, Dick's money goes to Bowery Street theater shows, oyster houses, and gambling. He's homeless. In terms of the day, he's a street Arab, one of a number of young men dispossessed by the need for literacy in order to enter the working class, let alone rise to the middle class. Ironically, Dick, although initially illiterate, lives in a world of print. He's a one-time newsboy who called out fake headlines to sell papers. He sleeps in a press room, and he comments on the location of several print powerhouses, including the American Tract Society. Now, by chance, Dick meets Frank Whitney, the nephew of the famous inventor, and serves as a guide to New York City. While Frank, who is elite and literate and college-bound, is well-educated in the traditional sense, it's Dick who masters the urban-rural environment, which during their tour is revealed to be fraught with danger. The crowds and anonymity of the city make it easy to run a scam. The complexity of the city makes it hard to learn the ropes. So Alger reveals many scams and schemes through Dick's story. Counterfeit currency, a bait-and-switch game in a store, fake Western investment opportunities, and pickpockets galore. The drop game should sound strikingly familiar to those of us who receive emails from a certain West African nation which apparently abounds with royalty in need of U.S. bank accounts. In this game, Dick and Frank are approached by a man who has found a wallet stuffed with bills. He's sure there's a reward for its return, but alas, he has to catch a train. So perhaps Dick and Frank would turn it in and claim the reward. But wait, the man reasons, since he was the honest person who found it, he should share in the reward. So if Dick just gives him $20, that should be more than enough to cover the ample reward, and Dick can keep all the balance. And now we all know where this is going. The wallet's stuffed with paper, not with bills. Frank is aghast, but Dick is unconcerned. Anticipating the con, Dick had given the con man a worthless piece of paper instead of the agreed-upon $20. So the educated Frank is no match for the streetwise Dick. And the difference between rural and urban worlds are further contrasted when Dick helps a rural youth who has come to the city with his father's life savings. The newbie encounters a man who has a check drawn on a New York bank. But alas, he too was late for the train and asks the rural rube for help. He'll sign over the bank draft in exchange for the cash. And once the bank opens, the rube can cash the draft and all will be square. The con man helpfully points out the correct building with grand columns and takes off, naturally, with the life savings. But it, too, is a scam, and by the time the rube encounters Dick, he's lost his father's money and soon learns that he's been ripped off. The draft is a fake, and the so-called bank building behind him is no bank at all. Dick calls the rube a baby, too green for the city. So Ragged Dick introduces the reader to an urban world of danger, a danger that had grown exponentially as populations rose. The danger is also antebellum Americans' great opportunity, the ability to reinvent oneself, to take on a new identity. Ragged Dick himself does so. By the end of the book, he is Richard Hunter and has achieved his dream, respectability. But how could you tell if someone's identity were genuine? Well, etiquette books helped. They defined manners and social situations so that there would be no surprises, so that everyone in your class would know these same social codes. But wait, can't a pretender read the same etiquette books and pass, assume the identity of gentility without actually being genteel? And what about those asking for help? As capitalism steamed ahead, the division between the haves and the have-nots continued to grow. Immigrants found the streets were not paved with gold, and legions of young men from the rural countryside found the same situation, as jobs were few and hands were many. Beggars became a frequent presence on the crowded streets, and opportunity abounds to what historian John Casson has called sham afflictions, turning sham afflictions into money. Shameless self-advertisers, cunning merchandisers of their own misfortune. Some of these social counterfeits even crafted reversible signs with multiple disabilities displayed so they could match their affliction to the particular audience at whim. For 19th century urban dwellers, the issue of social counterfeits and scam artists was economic. You wanted to avoid being ripped off. But it was also, critically, about identity and the stability of society. Again, as Casson writes, the presence of criminals and social counterfeits undermined the basic assumptions of middle-class life. They suggested that character was not permanent, but malleable, that identity was not coherent, but fragmented, and that social appearances were not dependable, but subject to the most cynical manipulation. And indeed, Ragged Dick himself is a social counterfeit on his city tour. Before setting off, Frank gives Dick a bath and a clean suit of clothes, and the result challenges perceptions. Dick's homeless friends fail to recognize him, and when one does, he threatens to beat him up because of his class-hopping pretensions. On a crowded streetcar, Dick and Frank are accused of picking the pocket of a lady. The conductor and all the patrons agree that neither Frank nor Dick look the part of a ruffian. The poor boy turned respectable had to return to his ragged clothes later in the story in order to retrieve a letter from the post office. When Dick is clothed with respectability, no postmaster would believe he was the Ragged Dick indicated in the address. The frauds of the city were well known in guidebooks, in manner and etiquette manuals, and pages of fiction, all warning neophytes of the dangers of shifting identity, and if you failed to heed that warning, you would indeed be in need of help. So Dick is able to master the urban environment. He does not ask for help, though he needs it. He's the literary model of the self-made man. He can tell truth from fiction, and he succeeds because of that. He is, of course, a bit of a scam artist, but his rags to riches story, or at least rags to respectability, set a powerful motif in American mythology of upward mobility and of the malleability of identity. But he also teaches us to be suspicious and to offer one's trust frugally. The growth of cities in the antebellum U.S. brought more desperate people. Without extensive funds or often without literacy, the desperate still had an opportunity to ask for help in a city full of potential benefactors. You could make your message direct, scrawled on cardboard or tin. Of course, we're very aware that cities were teeming with truly desperate people, but it's that realization that presents the opening for opportunists. And these direct pleas for help do not end in the 19th century. So we're going to jump to the end of the 20th and return to the personal plea, a low-tech, person-to-person ask. The collector and antiquarian bookseller Michael Zinman assembled a fascinating collection documenting hard times and those troubled by them. His collection of cardboard signs reflects some of the same themes we've seen earlier and are emblematic of that person-to-person connection that Dyer and Trask relied on. These signs are tiny stories of desperation, of failed ideals captured on cardboard. They're rendered a commodity when Zinman himself buys them. So here, I have no real grand analysis, other than I'm struck by the continuity of the human condition, the desperation faced, and the connections we try to establish, and the medium in which the need for help is made visible. So I'll share a few of these images with you, and perhaps in lieu of a grand conclusion, a starting point for discussion. If Dyer's story illuminated the challenges for women in the antebellum period, and Trask highlights the failure of medical knowledge, and both illustrate the lack of community resources for their particular circumstances, then what might these micro-stories tell us? Bold, sad, angry, even humorous, these micro-histories of jobs lost, homes broken, and families abandoned hope to exchange the truth of these lives for some cold, hard cash. So I'll show you a few of these from the Zinman collection, and there is a website where you can see a lot more of these, and I can share that with you if you're interested. So here's a story that gives us the title for this talk, Desperate for some Kindness. And can you read that? This is a story about a poor woman whose backpack was stolen. She lost her bus ticket. She lost everything, and she was even punched in the head, which was doubly unfortunate because she had just had brain surgery. And she adds to her sad tale her assertion that this is truly her last hope and resort. And she also adds a postscript that we should try and understand it isn't easy asking strangers for help. She adds a little diagram, a little picture in the center of a sad, smiley face with a hole in the center, and perhaps that's her brain surgery, an injury from being punched in the head. What's interesting is she's trying to tell us, she's trying to connect and say, I was just like you until I became ill, until I lost my husband. She had a family, and now he's gone. She had a home, but she can't get there. She is like us. Signs very directly give us indications of what we should be. Instead of being broke and hungry and in need of some kindness, we should be replete with money, a full stomach, and happy. Veterans are a frequent sign holder, both in the 19th century and the 21st. And these signs narrate in concise form the same sort of story, regardless of the century. I fought for your rights, now you fight for me. Here's a sign Mary Dyer might have held if she were in the 21st century, single mom. So here's a woman who, she's a mom, she had a job, she's asking for help. We have a pregnant woman as well who's very specific in her plea for $38. The single mom was once a worker just like you, and she's faced double adversity in these hard times. It's interesting that she is scared, and she contrasts that with the very almost teenage girl, rainbow, sunshine, and heart. We all need help sometimes reminds us that we do, and it begs the question, do you need help? Or perhaps, when will you need help? And here's a Tom Sawyer sign. Like Tom Sawyer and the whitewashed fence, or you might recall from Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, another genre of personal narratives, how he challenges white boys to write letters of the alphabet. And here's a sign that offers a challenge. Now, some signs, frankly, offer TMI, and this is one of them. But it also might point out a real need for help. And this is a very long and somewhat rambling story of a political problem, groups that are following him, people who want to kill him, hiding in the street, losing his clothes, maybe thrown out of the country, and on and on and on. But it reiterates that idea that there are some desperate people out there. Homelessness. The sheer number of signs reminds us again of that connection between the homed and the homeless. And here we see again that idea of what we should be living. We should have a home, we should have family and friends, we should have a full stomach. And these indicate that some do not. Another homeless sign. And again, that same sort of plea that Trask or Dyer made, or the man who accused Trask of scaring his horse, that someone ought to provide, the community ought to provide, and this sign indicates he doesn't have anyone to help. And so the implicit question is, will you? Students with signs. We have a student who says that he's in school, just needs a little help, so any spare change, which I think many of us can understand. And then we have this very sad sign, again, a person sleeping on the streets, they're extremely very hungry, lost their mom to cancer, only 22 years old, diabetic, trying to raise bus fare to get back to my college roommate's house in Dover so I can live with him and finish college. So again, we have this idea that I'm upwardly mobile, I'm moving into the middle class, but I just need some help. I like the food needed sign because it's written on a pizza box. And then, of course, there are those who will work for food. And then there are those who will teach for food at a certain Florida Keys university, which for some reason never has any job openings. Can't figure that out. The extent of one's losses are sometimes itemized. Having a real tough time. I lost my home, my job, my dog, and my clothes, just trying to get enough for a cheap room for the night, any amount. And again, an assertion that I'm just like you, a very nice, kind, good person, just caught in a bad situation. This is a bilingual portable sign. Very crafty here. And this person pulls no punches. He's not going to tell you a lie. He's not going to try to tell you some story about being punched in the brain. He says, I'm a street hustler. I work my old ass off for the hard working America woman, man who work hard hours to take care of your family. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm hot with cancer. Please let me work for you. Buckle up. And then we have the ones that are very creative. So today, the internet and TV serve as a democratizing factor in pushing one's agenda. Instead of Blackburn's modern pamphleteer, today we have a modern blogger, webmaster, or Facebook page. If you have a modicum of literacy and an internet connection, you too can appear in electronic print. Causes are big news and big business. We have a rainbow of cause ribbons and rubber wristbands that await our support and document our help. Videos go viral. Someone's unfortunate circumstance becomes the water cooler story of the day. Technology brings individual tragedy into our homes from halfway across the world. Today, even Mary Dyer and Leonard Trask have Facebook pages. Now, I want to believe my dollar offered in a subway will make a difference in the world, that righting the world's inequities is as simple as reaching into my pocket and reaching out to a fellow human. Tragedies abound, and the 24 hours news cycle makes the resulting desperation all the more visible. As Dyer and Trask and Blackburn and Alger all knew, one of the greatest opportunities of antebellum America was to make and remake yourself into the person you wanted to be, the ability to rise or return to respectability. And the opportunity as an estranged woman, as a disabled man, as a 21st century homeless, to tell your neighbors and to tell your strangers your story in print. A hallmark of American culture is the belief in the malleability of people and of character, from biblical roots to myths of self-made men such as Benjamin Franklin and Lincoln and Ragged Dick, to etiquette manuals, to quick-fix diets and magic cellulite-reducing pills. Americans can remake themselves, seemingly at will. Yet, the malleability, the ability to change, works in both directions. If your husband joins an odd religious group, if you become deformed, if you lose your money, your job, your clothes, and your dog, your presence becomes an uncomfortable reminder of the fragility of our cultural and individual stability, that our identities and lives can change in a heartbeat. Tragic events can change your home life to homelessness. Illness can change you from healthy to pitied. When you lose all your other assets, all you have left is your story. And in our capitalistic society, one response to tragedy is to throw money, through guilt or through fear or through generosity. Whether through pamphlets sold door to door or tin signs in a panhandler's hands, or calls for help against the endless footage of crashing tsunami waves, we are confronted with desperation on a global scale. And with a wary eye toward opportunists, scam artists, and social counterfeits, I hope most of us reach into our pockets for the dollar, desperate to show some kindness in an often unkind world. Thank you.
If you have questions, please hold up your hand and one of our students will bring you the microphone. Speak into the microphone, please.
Hello? Is it working? Yes. Thank you, Beth, for a wonderful talk. Very thought-provoking, a lot of interesting connections. I wonder, because I've been looking at this a lot lately, about the idea that personal narrative becomes a particularly feminist form of criticism. And I'm asking this because this claim is made in academics as of the 1980s, and it's losing steam as a whole bunch of academics want to come out with their personal narratives in a genre called personal criticism or autobiographical criticism. But the story you've presented to us stretches this way back, in Mary Dyer's case especially, as not just someone telling their story as it is, but telling their story with a pretty biting social critique attached to it too. So I wonder if you can say more about maybe how that genre is informing your work, or it may be working against your work, the kinds of things that you're discovering.
I think that's the thing that really intrigued me about Mary Dyer's story when I first encountered it, is it was much more than just a sob tale. And I think, when we look back into the early 19th century or the antebellum period, the height of these personal narratives, I mean, there were hundreds, thousands of these, but only a very few, I think, were read beyond their immediate moment. And I think it's works like Dyer's that make that transition, because there is that social critique. So in terms of shaping what it is that I do, I would have to thank Mary Dyer for kind of showing me that way, because I really look for that, what are readers responding to when they see this? On the one hand, with the Mary Bean pamphlets, you've got a good salacious story of a dead mill girl. But again, on the other hand, the reason why this genre becomes so popular is it touches some sort of fear or concern that's already in the popular consciousness. So these tales aren't telling people something new. In many cases, they're just reaffirming what people already believe to be true, whether they're articulating that or not. So at least in my own work, when I see these tales, I'm always, or I'm drawn to tales that to me speak to larger issues. And that's why Trask's tale to me is particularly interesting, because of this critique of the medical profession at a time period when you have competing philosophies of medicine, the allopathic physicians and the botanic physicians. And to me, that's really interesting and curious, and something that we touch on still today, that idea of chronic disease and any number of sufferers who will say, I just want to know what I have. I just want to know what I can do. So it's that larger window, I think, taking these stories as a microcosm of society, but at the same time blowing them out into larger issues. But I think you're absolutely right about Dyer. Dyer argues for a very traditional image. She wants to be a mother to her children. But she also frames it as saying, I want the just rights of women. She's not talking here about suffrage, but she's talking about agency. She's talking about the ability to control her own life. And for all her pretensions of, I followed Joseph and I was just trying to protect my children. No, she went to the Shakers because she wanted to be a preacher. That's why she went. She wanted her own religious agency. She wanted her own agency as a mother. She wanted her own agency as a woman. So I think you're absolutely right that there is this, I don't know if I'd call it pre-feminist or proto-feminist, or just a really savvy woman who very keenly understood you can get sentiment from women, but boo-hoo, that's not going to solve the problem. She needed laws. She needed laws and judges and legislators to help her.
Thank you, Beth. I'm curious if levity, the use of levity in asking for help, is fairly new, and if you have any idea if the use of levity actually has maybe a more profitable benefit for the person who is asking for help.
That's a really great question. I guess I don't know when levity would come into play, and so certainly anyone jump in here who has some thoughts. Yeah. When I was all of these images were from the Zinman collection, but I did a little Googling just to see what else was out there. And there are some hysterical ones. One of my favorites was, this is a sci-fi geek reference, but if any of you are fans of Battlestar Galactica and remember what Cylons looked like, they were kind of silvery robots that, you know, human actors inhabited in the show. And there's a great one of a Cylon on the side of a street in Hollywood, and he's got a sign that says, "A former Cylon need help, replaced by computer animated graphics." And I thought that one was beautiful. So I'm thinking of the 19th century accounts that I've read, and I haven't seen any that are intentionally humorous or that I think are intentional. I find some things funny, but I don't think they're intended that way. But certainly we see a lot in the cardboard signs today. I don't know, you know, that's a really good question, Marilyn. I'd be interested to see what other people think. Would you give more money to someone who said they were punched in the brain, or would you give more money to someone who's destitute? But then again, you know, we could think back now that I'm thinking of that, you know, you've got that Tom Sawyer motif that you're drawing on. You know, I bet you can't whitewash this fence, you know. And even, you know, Frederick Douglass, who's not using it humorously, but as a tool to advance his own literacy, challenging white boys, like, I bet I know more letters than you do. It's like, oh, you do not. Here are all my letters. That's...
I know when I'm scammed out of money, if it's for fun, I can roll off my neck.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and you know, I think that's kind of that thing about some of the scams that cut too close to the heart. You know, when someone's faking a disease, when they're, you know, using their children as props for some fake thing or something. And just a note on the woman with the brain story. Zinman, in the introduction to his, he has a little catalog of these. Relates the story that was one of the first ones that he saw, and he saw this woman, and she was sobbing silently in New York, and he read her sign, and he felt so bad, and he offered, as he buys these signs, and so he offered her $10 for the sign, which she accepted. Oh, thank you, my brain, my brain. And he walks down the street, and he felt bad for her, so he went back and he gave her another $50. And then a week later, he's in a different neighborhood, and there she is with a new sign. I was punched in the brain. And he kind of catches her eye, and she just kind of smiles and nods, and he knew he'd been scammed.
Hi. You mentioned that Mary Dyer recognized that you need men to get laws and legislation, whereas you got sentiment from women. Which do you think was more, contributed more to her financial success in the sale of her pamphlets? The sentiment from women or approaching men for change?
That's a really good question. Mary Dyer travels throughout New England, and, you know, she's selling her pamphlets, she's telling her story, and she's trying to tell her story in the 1820s to build up support to force the legislature to do something about the Shakers. But she goes to Boston, and what's really interesting is the way she gets to important people, like the governor and the mayor of Boston, and the governor of Massachusetts, the mayor of Boston, and several important legislators, is that she goes through the women. She goes through the wives. And when you read one of her accounts, she lists all these, you know, I saw Mrs. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so. And so I went to a city directory and I plotted out in a Boston map where they all were. And then I realized, wow, these are the wives of printers, of leading businessmen. She portrays that in her book as getting sympathy and support, especially after the death of her daughter Betsy, and how these women give her mourning clothes and mourning jewelry. And so she's trying to say, see, I have to be in the company of women in order to get what I should as a mother. But reading between the lines, you know, yeah, you're hanging out with the wife of the governor of Massachusetts, the wife of the newspaper publisher of the big Boston paper. You're getting to them through women. So which is more effective? You know, in some ways, I think, using her networks of women was effective to get entree to the larger areas of power. Ultimately, it's the change in New Hampshire divorce law that frees her and gives her her independence. But that's a great question. I'm going to go with women. That's going to be a good essay question next time I teach a brief statement.
Thanks, Vinny. Hey, Beth. So it strikes me that, the alternative to getting help through these sentimental stories, I mean, one is to sort of advocate for your legal rights, but another is sort of people organizing and making demands, like sort of union-style demands, those sorts of things. And that the alternative to a society in which at any moment, you could end up on the streets with a sign in your hands is a society with a robust safety net of some kind. And we're certainly living through this political period where unions are on the decline, unions are under attack, murals that depict unions are hostile to business, and the safety net is eroding too. And I'm just curious if you think, is there something about America that we like it, that there's this appeal to sentiment, that this, appeal to charity, this like tinge of there is the risk that you'll fall all the way down, there's something in our spirit about this that we want that to be there, that sort of desperate quality that is going to require some people to need kindness, if you know what I mean.
So we want desperate people so we can show our generosity? Yeah. That's interesting thought. Feel free to jump in here. I kind of think about that. I don't know. It provides a mirror. It certainly provides a certain mirror for us to constantly evaluate ourselves and our own generosity and where we see ourselves and, the human condition. That constant reminder of there, but for the grace of God go I. I think in some ways it's a way to measure our moral progress as individuals. I don't know. I'm kind of stumped on that one, Brian, so please jump in here. Anyone? What do you think?
I'm constantly amazed. I guess I'm constantly amazed by the sort of like how robust this particular style of American politics is, which is like government is bad, government is the enemy, a safety net is actually a trap.
Yeah.
And
it's
it seems to have incredible resonance in our politics. And so, I don't know. If I figure it out, I'll be famous.
Okay, Leah, let me know. Yeah.
Well, I suppose one version or one question that might come out of that is if it's not going to be a government-funded social safety net, I mean, at what point in the 19th century do you find the private philanthropic societies emerging, which also have implications for, who are the people providing that care? Are Victorian outreach programs, basically?
Yeah.
And what it would be the difference then between someone, at least in the examples that you've given, both the 19th century and 20th century versions, it seems as though, again, yes, it's individual agency being emphasized. That person is asking for help from a body of people, but more or less in their own terms, using their language, using their own rhetorical flourishes, and making these kinds of choices, as opposed to having to put themselves, on the mercy of a group which may have more specific ideas about or conditions for the kind of care they might provide that would be both a benefit but some kind of restriction as well. So,
yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking about antebellum maternal reform associations, maternal benevolent associations that will help poor women and help poor mothers, but clearly helping them into terms dictated by middle-class white women, middle-class white Protestant women, that this is the way to be a good mother. We'll help you be a good mother our way. And the same, I think, is true in the Victorian period and kind of progressive era reform societies, the same sort of thing that, even, Jane Addams and Hull House and settlement house movement, again, it's a very, we're going to help immigrants Americanize, but we're going to teach you the right food to cook, not, that beans and rice, not that stuff with tomato sauce. You're going to have good corned beef and cabbage or whatever we're going to boil up, because that's a good New England dinner. So there are some there are this kind of constraints on it. So in some ways, I think what attracts me to these signs is, again, that idea of agency is like, here are my terms. You can help me. You can throw a quarter at me. That's how you can help. You can help me. I'll make you laugh with my ninja story, but I still want you to help me. But this is my terms, not yours. Yeah, that's interesting. Katie, did you have a thought? Because I saw your hand go up too. And I know this is your time period.
Not reiterate, but iterate what the woman in the front said about this being about individualism. If you're going to fail, it's on your individual terms, and if I'm going to help you, it's on my individual terms. We're not going to have a safety net. I think this is a rhetoric we're seeing in the present. And something I was thinking of before I raised my hand was, a lot of these signs, they actually appeal to people as individuals, especially the things about God.
Yeah.
You're walking down Monument Square in Portland, and it's, God be with you. It's about you, and I think I interpreted that as, if I'm going to be with God, I'm going to help you. As in, I'm one with God. You're one with God. I should be helping you. As it's a one-on-one relationship. It's not about social safety nets. It's not about a community, which. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting how there's something different about these signs to me than Mary Dyer, I guess.
Yeah.
In different time periods, perhaps, but it seems to be much more one-on-one. It's just general observation, but.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. And, embedded in these signs is always, again, that Horatio Alger myth that, we don't know that this person is not going to rise from rags to riches. And we have the example of the man who held up the sign, I've forgotten his name, with the golden voice, who stood on corners and someone's, discovered him, and now he's a radio DJ or something. So he's lived that rags to riches. And I mean, there's the file, what happens next? And isn't that kind of our thinking when you see, should I give this person money? No, that person will just drink it or smoke it or blah, 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 and, that won't be help. So there's that tension between wanting to help with no strings attached, but wanting to help you want to believe that your dollar's going to make a difference in your terms, not necessarily their terms.
Beth, we have a question from Anouar, remote. He says, hello, Beth. Thank you very much for a stimulating and moving presentation. Your talk shows that great ideas can be perfectly combined with compassion and kindness of the highest sort. Could you reflect a bit on whether America's strong tradition of self-help works against or complements America's rather exceptional, in my view, culture of philanthropy? Thank you. Anouar.
Hi, Anouar. I'm remembering the question. So whether our culture, our long tradition of self-help goes with or goes against philanthropy?
Works against or complements America's rather exceptional, in his view, culture of philanthropy.
Wow. And once again, I'm stunned. That's a great question, Anouar. Thank you for asking that. I guess I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, we do have this fabulous culture of philanthropy that supports just about everything we can imagine. But I think that, again, that idea that we should pull ourselves up by the bootstraps is just so pervasive in our culture that in some ways I think it almost works a little bit against it, that we're looking for the deserving poor, the deserving candidates, that again, there seems to be kind of conditions set on, philanthropy, and that there's, that self-help is almost expected as a first step. And going back to Dyer, there's that tension if she helps her, and she found this when she helped herself and provided for herself. The courts would say, well, clearly you're not destitute because you're well fed, you're well clothed, so Joseph must be taking care of you enough. If she said nothing and was truly destitute, then no one would hear her. So I think in some ways, philanthropy sometimes looks for self-help as that first step, so the two almost work in tension with each other. Audience? Oh, good. I see hands going up going, no, she's full of it. Yeah.
Not being a historian, and maybe I'm inaccurate in terms of sequence, but if I'm not mistaken, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the society attempted to handle this sort of poor, disenfranchised, and disabled folks by warehousing them out on the fringes of society. And large state institutions were developed, some which still remain. Pineland would be an example of that type of an institution where folks could drop off a disobedient wife and proclaim her to be mentally ill, and she would reside there until somebody came to save her. And then right around 1920, there was the moral movement where there was an attempt by health professions and occupational therapists to begin to work with the disabled and to rehabilitate them, or to find ways to improve their lives and reintegrate them into society. And then in the 60s, the Great Society provided a lot of fund to return all of these folks back into the community, wherein government and political agencies abandoned them. And so we're back to the cardboard signs in the street and people, begging, for help and some human kindness, where in fact, the government did attempt to do that. I think it sort of gets at what Brian was asking earlier. And I don't know that this is a question other than if you have a response to that. And philanthropy has been in and around that. It has, tried, and there are some very successful examples of philanthropic attempts to solve these problems, but there's always sort of a pullback, and right now we're faced with sort of an overabundance of this type of appealing. Yeah. I'll stop talking.
Okay. And I think Beth wanted to say, and from the health professions, so we'll.
I'll jump in first
Oh,
because I'm
I'm
holding
sorry,
this,
Eric,
and then I can pass on. Just an observation. I was sort of struck by Brian's question earlier, and it strikes me that, and this just would be a hypothesis, I guess, that maybe there's a couple of different things going on. One would be there's a chronological thing, as John was commenting on, so that sort of across time, discourses of poverty and help might change. But there's also, Brian raises an interesting point, is there a cultural distinction as well? And I'm, as a Europeanist, sort of thinking about the European case, and in the cases that immediately jump to mind would be more racially defined. So in the 19th century, the Irish had a reputation as great beggars, and British travel right. Part of this was this British sense of self-help as the way to be. But British travelers going to Ireland would comment on how their carriages were followed by long contrails of impoverished Irish people, periodically dropping dead from famine as they tried to keep up with the carriage, asking for cash. And also in the Irish case, of course, now travelers would be the ethnic group which is essentially a sort of unsettled Irish population that's distinct from the settled Irish population. And they're great. They have a whole culture of ways of separating people from their money. And the most prominent one is the tone-deaf child singing, and you pay them so they'll stop. And then, of course, if you go to continental Europe, the class of beggar would be the Roma, the gypsies, who again have a whole series of different ways of separating people from their brass. And in each of those examples, and I don't know if those are the only examples, I'm sure there's more examples, but in each one of those cases there's an ethnic distinction. And so asking for money, begging, becomes a kind of marker of ethnic difference, of otherness from the dominant community, and particularly the settled community. So I mean, it's just an observation, but it would be an interesting comparative project to sort of look at cultural discourses, and discourses across time as well, and to see how that shapes the request for help.
Yeah, and I think and thank you for all these good comments and questions as I start to think about this Leonard Trask project, because one thing that I do note in many antebellum pleas for help pamphlets, like Trask and even Dyer, they're very careful to establish their nativity, that they have long lines of ancestors, that they've been here. Mary Dyer writes lengthy passages about her grandfather who was in the Revolution, and he wore homespun, and he still wears homespun, and he's a real patriot. And I think you're right, Eric. I think there is something especially as we get into the 20s, 30s, 40s in the 19th century, that there is this class and ethnic distinction being made. So it's something that very much I should pay attention to as we look through the history of kind of changing philosophies of philanthropy.
Well, I do think there's a very strong American tendency to want to support people we feel making an effort. Look at Habitat for Humanity, how that's very popular. People who get houses in that program are people who are willing to put in some work. And the scholarships that high school kids get, if they can get through school, then they can go on to college. These are, I watched a show this weekend, The Secret Millionaire. It's the first time I watched it, and he goes on to Skid Row, and he's trying to tell the scams from the people who are really making an effort, and then he gives his money to the three groups that he feels are really sincerely making an effort, and where the people involved are trying very hard to improve their lives. I think as Americans we like that, and we really like the people. I think we might respond, I know I would respond to humor in a sign, because I feel, at least that person's keeping up a good attitude. So I'd give them money over somebody who didn't, who seemed totally destitute.
And that's, and that raises a good point that we often see in terms of tragedy. There's that, like the guy said, buckle up, and maybe he meant buck up. But that idea of, keep that positive attitude. If you keep that positive attitude, right, you will survive. And the most repeated word in Leonard Trask's account is persevere and perseverance. Repeatedly, he says, I persevered, despite all of the different tragedies that befall him.
And just looking into the area of healthcare, therapists and doctors, we like good patients. Good patients are people who work hard and want to improve. God help you if you're really, really sick and depressed and don't have that drive or energy. Nobody's going to be too interested in you. Be honest about it.
Yeah.
So I do think there is that. But then on the other hand, like with Japan right now, Japan has not had the people appealing like you had with Haiti so much, or New Orleans, and they're getting less donations, which could be our own financial aspects. But some people are donating so they feel better, not to help the Japanese, because they feel like they need to and that they're obliged to help.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a little bit the other side, people helping to help themselves and getting a benefit from that and feeling, blessing from that, from helping others. So those people are there to help the people who aren't trying, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But I do think as Americans we like it. I always think this is a land of redemption. You can do anything as long as you're willing to seek redemption, and then we love it.
Well, and there's that malleability that it's,
Right. So if you're willing to change your life and redeem, people will just be, throwing help at you, and I find that just remarkable, But there's no doubt that there's a lot of scamming going on right now, which is very unfortunate. No matter how much we educate older people about these, they still fall for them. And I know myself, as I've gotten older, I've tended to fall more for scams. So, hence the timeshares. But it is constantly, you constantly have to figure out, am I dealing with a real situation, or am I dealing with a scam?
Yeah. Well, just this morning, I won a lottery. And all I have to do is send my checking account number, and the money will be delivered to me shortly. And then there was an email for one of the listservs I'm on, beware, Dr. So-and-so's email has been hacked and you may be scammed by the end of the week, which may in itself have been a scam, I don't know. But yeah, it's pervasive.
We have one more here. This is Daniel from Virginia, and we'll close on this one, if it's all right. Any thoughts on the value of anonymity of the desperate? For example, the willingness to give aid to peoples reported by the news whose plight is on the other side of the world versus the clearly disabled man on the street corner. Does distance from the plight assist our comfort level in giving?
That's a great question, Daniel. Wow, that is a great question. I mean, there's something so immediate by the person on the street that, that I think in some ways tugs at your heart, but it also frightens you at the same time. I think it's a lot easier to write a check that's being sent to someone halfway around the world. We don't have to confront them. They don't remind us of our own fallibility. They don't remind us that our community has, that this individual has fallen through our safety net. So I think distance does make it easier, I think, to help sometime. As much as we want to help local, there's something very uncomfortable about admitting to ourselves the problems that are right in our own backyard. Because I think in some ways we question, I could be part of this solution, but am I also part of the problem?
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk and for responding to so many questions.
Thank you.